The Lost Battalion. The battalion marched into the Argonne Forest, the trees so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground, and a heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of their boots. Jackson led the battalion with steady resolve, his mind focused on the mission, though a gnawing unease had settled in his gut, warning him of the dangers that lay ahead. Charlie, the youngest among them, clutched his rifle tightly, his wide eyes darting between the shadows, trying to suppress the fear that churned within him, but failing miserably. The Argonne Forest seemed to close in around them, a labyrinth of twisted roots and ancient trees, where every step forward felt like a descent into some unknown abyss. Alice, the battalion's medic, moved with purpose, her hands never far from her medical bag, ready to mend the broken bodies that war would inevitably deliver to her care. Frank, with his hardened gaze, walked at the rear, his face betraying no emotion, though he knew all too well the horrors that awaited them in these dark woods. The first ambush came swiftly, the crack of gunfire shattering the oppressive silence, and suddenly, the battalion found itself fighting for survival in a chaotic, blood-soaked frenzy. Jackson barked orders, his voice a lifeline amid the chaos, pulling his men back from the brink of panic, urging them to hold the line despite the relentless enemy fire. The battalion pushed forward, their footsteps now soaked in mud and blood, the forest floor a treacherous battlefield where danger lurked in every shadow. Charlie stumbled, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he forced himself to keep moving, the sounds of war a deafening roar in his ears, drowning out everything else. Alice tended to the wounded, her hands steady even as bullets whizzed past, her focus solely on keeping her comrades alive, though the odds seemed impossibly stacked against them. Frank's experience showed in his every move, his instincts guiding him through the madness, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. Days passed in a blur of exhaustion and terror, the battalion's supplies dwindling with each passing hour, their hope of rescue fading like the last light of day in the thick forest. The forest became their prison, its dense canopy a ceiling that trapped them in a world of perpetual twilight, where every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. Jackson struggled to keep his men united, the weight of command pressing heavily on his shoulders, knowing that despair could be as deadly as the enemy that surrounded them. Charlie found himself relying on Frank more and more, the veteran's grim wisdom a lifeline in the darkness, though each lesson came with a cost that weighed heavily on the young recruit. Alice fought to maintain morale, her words a balm for the wounded souls around her, even as she silently battled her own fears and doubts in the solitude of the forest. Frank, ever the realist, knew that the chances of survival were slim, but he continued to push forward, refusing to give in to the despair that threatened to consume them all. The battalion encountered another ambush, this time more brutal and relentless, as the enemy closed in from all sides, determined to crush the isolated soldiers. Jackson led a desperate charge, his voice hoarse from shouting, as he urged his men to break through the enemy lines, to find some semblance of safety in the unforgiving wilderness. Charlie's hands shook as he fired his rifle, the recoil jarring his whole body, but he forced himself to keep shooting, to keep fighting, even as fear clawed at his heart. Alice worked frantically, her fingers stained with blood as she tried to patch up the wounded, her mind racing to stay ahead of the chaos, her spirit unbroken despite the odds. Frank moved like a ghost through the battlefield, his eyes sharp and focused, each action precise, as he fought to keep the battalion together in the face of overwhelming danger. They managed to break through, but not without losses, the forest swallowing up the fallen, their comrades' absence a heavy weight on the survivors' hearts as they continued on. Jackson counted the remaining soldiers, his heart sinking as he realized how few of them were left, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it, not when so many lives still depended on him. Charlie stumbled over the roots and rocks, his body aching with exhaustion, but he kept moving, driven by the need to survive, to prove that he wasn't just another casualty of war. Alice barely slept, her mind constantly on the next wounded soldier she might have to save, the constant threat of death a shadow that loomed over her every waking moment. Frank watched over them all, his eyes ever vigilant. As the forest seemed to grow darker and more hostile with each passing day, the enemy never far behind. The battalion grew quieter, the camaraderie of the early days replaced by a grim determination, their laughter a distant memory, their conversations now whispers of survival. Jackson knew that they were running out of time, their supplies almost gone, and the enemy closing in, but he refused to give up, not when there was still a chance, however small. Charlie found solace in the routine of cleaning his rifle, the familiar motions grounding him, even as the world around him seemed to spiral further into chaos and darkness. Alice held on to hope, though it felt like a fragile thing, easily shattered, but she knew that without it, they would all be lost, their spirits broken beyond repair. Frank knew that hope was a dangerous thing, but he also knew that without it, they wouldn't last another day in the relentless forest that seemed to hunger for their lives. Another attack came in the dead of night, the enemy using the cover of darkness to strike, and the battalion fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their lives hanging by a thread. Jackson fought alongside his men, his hands stained with mud and blood, his voice hoarse from shouting orders, his mind focused on the fight, but his heart heavy with loss. Charlie fired until his hands went numb, his mind blank with fear, his body moving on instinct alone, driven by the will to survive, to see another sunrise in the endless forest. Alice saved who she could, her hands moving with a practiced precision, but she knew that not everyone could be saved, and each loss was a wound that cut deeper than the last. Frank fought with a cold efficiency, his every move calculated, but even he could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at him, the endless battle wearing him down. The night seemed to last forever, the darkness a living thing that pressed in on them from all sides, but somehow, the battalion held on, their will to survive unbroken. Dawn broke over the Argonne Forest, the light weakened pale, but it brought with it a brief respite, a moment of calm in the midst of the relentless storm of war. Jackson gathered his remaining men, his voice steady but strained, as he laid out their plan, knowing that their only hope was to keep moving, to outlast the enemy. Charlie listened intently, his mind focused on the task ahead, though the fear still gnawed at him, the thought of what lay beyond the next ridge a constant source of dread. Alice checked her supplies, her fingers brushing over the dwindling bandages and morphine, knowing that every decision she made could mean the difference between life and death. Frank loaded his rifle with methodical precision, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement, his instincts sharp despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. They moved out, their steps slow and cautious, the forest eerily silent around them, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next attack. Jackson led the way, his senses on high alert, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig a potential threat, the weight of command a heavy burden on his tired shoulders. Charlie followed close behind, his eyes wide with fear and determination, his grip on his rifle tight, as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. Alice walked in the middle, her thoughts on the wounded she had left behind, their faces haunting her even as she focused on keeping the remaining soldiers alive. Frank took up the rear, his gaze ever vigilant, his mind calculating the risks, always thinking 2 steps ahead, knowing that their survival depended on staying 1 step ahead of the enemy. They walked for hours, the forest stretching on endlessly, the oppressive silence weighing heavily on them, each step forward a small victory in the battle for survival. The enemy found them again, a sudden burst of gunfire shattering the silence, and once more, the battalion was thrown into the chaos of battle, their lives on the line. Jackson rallied his men, his voice a beacon in the darkness, urging them to hold the line, to fight with everything they had left, though he knew they were running on empty. Charlie fired until his rifle clicked empty, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind screaming at him to run, but he stood his ground, refusing to let fear control him. Alice worked tirelessly, her hands stained with blood, her mind focused on the wounded, her spirit unbroken despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. Frank fought with a grim determination, his every move precise and calculated, his experience the only thing keeping him alive in the chaotic storm of battle. The battle raged on, the forest echoing with the sounds of gunfire and shouted orders, but the battalion held on, their will to survive stronger than the fear that threatened to consume them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battle finally ended, the enemy retreating into the shadows, leaving the battalion bloodied but alive, their spirits unbroken. Jackson surveyed the battlefield, his heart heavy with the losses they had suffered, but he knew that they had survived against all odds, their strength forged in the fires of war. Rescue finally came, a relief that felt almost unreal after the endless days of battle, but the men of the lost battalion knew they were forever changed by the horrors they had faced.